Hi, and welcome to Creepy Crime Story, where the darkest truths aren't imagined. They're real. Raleigh, North Carolina, July 13th, 2011. Early evening in the middle of a humid Carolina summer. 27-year-old Laura Ackerson, a young mother of two, drives across town to see her children. Neighbors recall seeing her car pull into the complex, but after that, Laura simply drops off the map. Within days, her name will shift from a custody calendar into a homicide file, and her remains will be found more than 1,000 miles away in Texas waters. What begins as a domestic dispute escalates into one of the most chilling cross-state crime investigations of the decade. The first hours matter most. Investigators always look at what's normal and what's missing. In Laura's case, the normal pattern was clear: reliable check-ins with her children, consistent work attendance, and constant phone use. The missing pattern was just as stark. After July 13th, there were no verified calls, no texts, no appearance at the scheduled July 15th custody exchange. That negative evidence, the silence of a phone usually active, stood out. When she failed to show up on July 15th, the first explanations sounded ordinary. Maybe a delay, maybe miscommunication. But by Monday, July 18th, when colleagues noticed she hadn't shown up to work and couldn't be reached, the picture hardened. A missing person report was filed in Raleigh. Officers began standard canvassing, checking with friends, logging in-person visits, running through DMV records to ensure her vehicle hadn't been flagged. At the Camden Crest Apartments on Summit Manor Lane, where her children's father lived, investigators found a quiet anomaly. Laura's Ford Focus was parked there. No signs of forced entry into the vehicle, no broken glass, no immediate reason to assume theft. Yet the absence of Laura herself raised questions. Why would she leave the car, but not return to it? Responding officers noted lights in one unit switched on and off at irregular hours. A neighbor mentioned late-night movement that weekend, unusual in an otherwise calm residential complex. These were observations, not conclusions, but they created an early pattern of unease. Minutes and hours were logged carefully. Last sighting on July 13th, expected custody pickup on July 15th, missing report July 18th. The interval of silence was both a timeline and an alarm bell. Investigators requested preliminary tower pings for her cell, noting the lack of activity after the 13th. This dark interval gave them a starting block: her presence in Raleigh, her absence everywhere after. By the end of July 18th, the Raleigh Police Department escalated her case from missing adult to suspicious disappearance. The triggers were clear: reliable personal patterns broken, vehicle found but driver missing, and digital silence. Each point alone might have suggested a temporary absence. Combined, they signaled something else. For investigators, the first stage was about eliminating the ordinary. Did she leave voluntarily? Did she take a trip? Did she confide in anyone about plans? Interviews with friends and coworkers produced nothing to support that. One coworker described her as focused, reliable, always texting the kids. Another recalled that she had spoken of upcoming plans and legal obligations tied to the custody dispute, not the profile of someone preparing to vanish. This first stage also framed the human dimension. Two children were waiting, expecting a mother who never arrived. A workplace was short one reliable staff member. A car sat immobile in a parking lot. Each of those details would later be parsed in court, but in real time, they created the urgency that pulled more resources into the case. Forensic officers documented the Ford Focus. Exterior intact, no forced entry, no movement after July 13th. They logged odometer readings, tire pressure, and any trace in the cabin. The absence of Laura's purse or phone in the vehicle meant those items were still unaccounted for. Nothing in the car gave the impression she had walked away casually. From a community perspective, the case quickly gained traction. Raleigh isn't known for unexplained disappearances, especially involving young mothers in the midst of custody disputes. When that silence expanded beyond a few days, it felt less like a delay and more like an interruption with intent behind it. The puzzle at this point was simple on paper, but sharp in reality. Laura was last confirmed alive on July 13th, expected on July 15th, reported missing on July 18th, and her car was present but unused. Investigators didn't yet have a crime scene. What they had was a timeline that suddenly fractured. And in true crime, fractured timelines almost always point to concealed violence. As the first response teams logged their notes, the question hovered. Was this a mother who left, or was this a disappearance that required a forensic file? With no phone activity, no sightings, and a vehicle abandoned in plain sight, the balance leaned toward the latter. The handoff began on July 24, 2011. According to police reports and contemporaneous media, Fort Bend County authorities packaged what they recovered under sealed evidence numbers, log times, and transported the containers to the medical examiner. No dramatics, just chain of custody, one signature after another, so every movement could stand up in court. At intake, technicians photographed each container before opening. Exterior labels, seal integrity, and temperature readings were recorded. Inside, remains were cataloged by anatomical region without speculation. A pathologist dictated notes into the case record: condition, apparent cut surfaces, presence or absence of soft tissue, and any foreign material worth preserving. Swabs and clippings were taken for DNA, histology, and trace chemistry. Nothing left the room unnumbered. The initial classification was preliminary by design. Tool mark impressions were measured, not interpreted. Examiners described length, kerf width, striation uniformity, and saw pattern characteristics. That level of detail matters later when analysts compare marks against known blade types. In this phase, the file records shape and dimension, not conclusions. The goal is reproducibility. Another examiner could read the sheet and verify the same measurements. Identification moved on a parallel track. Dental comparison was prioritized because it is fast and courtroom-proof when done properly. Radiographs of recovered teeth were matched against known dental records attributed to Laura Ackerson. DNA was taken as confirmatory, using reference samples from known relatives per standard procedure. When the identifiers were in alignment, dental and DNA, the case file shifted from John Jane Doe nomenclature to a named victim. That single administrative change is crucial. It links the Texas evidence directly to the active Raleigh missing person investigation. Toxicology sampling followed protocol. Vitreous, muscle, and marrow, where available, were collected with clean instruments and placed into labeled vacutainers. Because postmortem chemistry can be altered by environmental exposure, the report marked many tox items as working until a lab could confirm. The file did not overreach. If a matrix was too degraded for a reliable reading, that limitation was written, not guessed around. Photography was exhaustive. Ruler and frame, case number on card, overhead and oblique lighting to capture tool mark texture. When additional skeletal elements were recovered later, those pieces were added under the same case number and photographed in exactly the same way. Consistency prevents defense arguments about mismatched documentation. From a legal standpoint, this room was the first defensible scene. The creek is a recovery location. The morgue is where evidence control starts. Every sealed bag, every timestamp builds a bridge to court. The tone in these reports is intentionally cold because credibility depends on dispassion. In towns like Raleigh and counties like Fort Bend, murders aren't just crimes. They pull at the quiet fabric of ordinary life. But in this room, emotion has no evidentiary value. What did the file confirm at this stage? Identity. Dismemberment. A pattern of cuts consistent with powered tooling. What stayed preliminary? Tool type attribution beyond class characteristics, toxicology interpretation, and any timeline inferences. The data would later interface with Raleigh scene work and retail digital records, but Chapter 2 stops short of that. No leapfrogging into who or why, no replay of the creek recovery. Intake, preservation, identification, that's the scope. There's a small operational lesson here that matters beyond one case. Families deserve answers, but the way to get there is through procedures that survive scrutiny years later. The data aligned too cleanly. Sometimes that was the problem, one investigator would say, about cases where narrative gets ahead of proof. This file stays with proof. By the time the medical examiner signed the initial report, the homicide investigation could speak with precision. Laura Ackerson had been identified. Remains were processed under controlled conditions. The physical state indicated post-mortem dismemberment. Evidence was preserved for later comparison to tools and chemicals recovered elsewhere. That clarity would matter when North Carolina detectives returned to a Raleigh apartment and began asking why drains had been scrubbed and why a vehicle sat still while a mother did not return. The search returned to Raleigh with a single objective: determine whether an indoor location could explain a disappearance that began on July 13th. Detectives obtained a search warrant for an apartment tied to Laura's last known visit. Entry was documented on video. A log captured who crossed the threshold and at what time. According to police reports and contemporaneous media, nothing on the door jambs or locks indicated forced entry. The unit read as orderly at first glance, but technicians record small deviations, and those tend to matter. A chemical odor was noted on arrival. Technicians preserved air samples and photographed the bathroom before any intrusive testing. Swabs were taken from the sink perimeter, faucet bases, and the drain surround. Grout lifts were removed from floor corners where water often pools after heavy cleaning. Those samples were tagged, working pending lab confirmation of any cleaning agents. A quick presumptive screen suggested a household bleach signature. No dramatic statements, just a line on a form and a sealed vial destined for the lab. The search was deliberately methodical. A lint trap was bagged. The interior of a bathtub drain was collected with a sterile loop. The rim of a plastic bin in a hall closet was swabbed for trace. Nothing was interpreted at the scene. Notes captured location, condition, and chain of custody numbers. In this kind of file, procedure is not a matter of style. It's the only way to defend results years later. Technicians recovered hair consistent in color and length with known photographs of Laura. That observation alone proves nothing, so they did what policy requires. A strand was packaged for microscopy and DNA comparison. Only after testing would any report label it confirmed. Items likely handled by multiple residents were triaged for touch DNA cautiously because mixed profiles can complicate a prosecution rather than clarify it. The priority was to identify traces that connect a named victim to a tightly circumscribed space and time frame. Water usage at the unit was reviewed through management records. According to the building's maintenance logs, there were entries about plumbing checks around mid-July. Those notes were copied for the case file. A neighbor interview described water running later than normal that week. Another recalled movement into the unit after dark without the usual hallway chatter or music. These are small points, but together they answer a practical question. Was there unusual activity consistent with post-event cleaning? The entry logs and witness statements made that inference reasonable, though still working until lab results supported it. The vehicle, Laura's Ford Focus, remained at the complex. Scene officers reprocessed it under improved hypotheses. The exterior showed no forced entry, which matched the first pass, but this time they added comparative photographs of tire position against the painted lines, a trick that sometimes captures whether a vehicle has been repositioned between sighting dates. Here, there was no clear evidence it had moved. Interior work focused on driver controls, seat slide and backrest angle, and steering wheel wipe patterns. The objective was narrow. Is there any sign Laura drove away after July 13th? Odometer readings, a fuel level log, and nearby camera checks were compiled to answer that. According to the documentation available in contemporaneous media, investigators did not verify any post-13 travel by Laura in that car, a negative finding that tightens the timeline without drama. Parking lot cameras at many garden-style complexes in 2011 were limited. Where recordings were available, clubhouse, pool, or entry lanes, they were pulled and archived. The quality was uneven, typical of the era, but timestamps could still pin general vehicle presence. When footage couldn't deliver, officers interviewed residents whose cars shared the same row. People remember oddities better than routines. One neighbor recalled a white cooler carried awkwardly by two adults on a warm night. That statement was logged as working testimony. Corroboration would have to come from receipts and later physical evidence. Inside the unit, the team avoided luminol or broad-spectrum spraying that might contaminate drains or delicate trace. Given the morgue's documentation of dismemberment, analysts prioritized areas where cleanup would logically concentrate. Sink traps and tub drains are better evidence than glowing baseboards because they preserve microparticulates and any residual chemistry that survives rinsing. Each sample left the apartment under seal, the forms signed, and the forms mattered as much as the contents. The most useful aspect of this scene work was not any single swab, but the alignment of multiple quiet anomalies. No forced entry. A documented cleaning signature pending lab confirmation. Hair potentially attributable to Laura in a place connected to her last known movements. A vehicle that did not accompany her away from the complex. The pattern makes an indoor event more likely than a voluntary disappearance. In towns like this, murders aren't just crimes. They strain the quiet systems of ordinary life. Apartment schedules, neighbors' routines, the way a parking lot looks the same every night until it doesn't. From a human perspective, the value of this step is accountability. Families are owed more than a story. They are owed a record. This room produced a record. If a jury ever had to decide what happened and where, they wouldn't rely on a theory about a creek hundreds of miles away. They would see a bathroom, a drain, and a list of samples collected by people who signed their names next to every bag. The working theory that emerged was narrow and testable. The apartment functioned as the primary scene, and the car was not the path out for the victim. That is not speculation. It is a structured reading of what the scene allowed and what it excluded. The next step would be to square those impressions with the 2011 digital tools available, retail cameras, receipts, and carrier records, to see if purchases and movements lined up with a cleanup window. Next, the record had to show whether purchases and movements matched an indoor event in Raleigh and a disposal in Texas. Detectives worked the timeline the way 2011 allowed: carrier logs, retail transactions, and whatever cameras sat above store aisles and parking lots. According to police reports and contemporaneous media, a North Carolina big box location recorded a purchase of a reciprocating saw and blades on July 14th, the morning after Laura Ackerson was last confirmed seen. The timestamp and receipt number were pulled. Still images were extracted in sequence: entry, aisle approach, checkout, exit. Clerks were interviewed for routine identification only: who rang the sale, whether cash or card. The documentation didn't try to interpret intent. It wrote down time, item, and method of payment. Carrier records were requested for devices linked to the household Laura visited. In 2011, those records gave call detail and sector-level tower usage. Investigators plotted activity against the apartment timeline fixed in Chapter 3. One pattern mattered. Laura's device showed no verifiable call or text traffic after July 13th. That dark interval remained a negative finding, but it framed everything else. When one line goes quiet, the lines around it get louder. Movement by other devices around the complex, later toward route corridors, suggested travel that Laura did not share. Financial polls corroborated what the cameras had started. Card activity tied to the July 14th tool purchase in North Carolina landed within the disappearance window, not weeks before or after. Later that week, transactions surfaced in Texas for muriatic acid and chemical-resistant gloves near the Oyster Creek corridor. Store managers provided aisle maps so detectives could see where those items sat in relation to entrances, exits, and cameras. The detail seems small, but it allows a jury to follow a person's path, in, to chemicals, to checkout, and out again, within minutes. License plate coverage in 2011 was inconsistent across states, so no one promised plate-by-plate tracking. Where exterior cameras existed, hotel lots, gas stations, and roadway businesses, detectives requested clips by date and hour. Even when resolution was poor, time brackets let them cross-check fuel purchases, register prints, and point-of-sale logs. In several instances, timing of a fuel receipt could be paired with a camera angle that showed a vehicle lingering at a pump lane just long enough to match the transaction. The Raleigh apartment had already signaled heavy cleaning through working chemical indicators. Digital and financial records now sketched how those supplies could be acquired and when. The sequencing was mechanical. Tool purchase in North Carolina shortly after the last seen date, then later chemical purchases in Fort Bend County before disposal actions confirmed by morgue intake. No single receipt proved homicide. Together, they undercut any suggestion that events were random or reactive. The data aligned too cleanly. Sometimes that was the problem. Investigators also checked for purchases that didn't appear. No boarding passes in Laura's name, no hotel registrations by her after July 13th, no banking pattern that looked like a voluntary break. Absence isn't proof on its own, but in a system of corroboration it removes alternative explanations. When viewed next to a stationary car and an apartment with working indicators of post-event cleaning, the retail receipts became more than shopping. They became timestamps that fit only one path. Witness statements were measured against this matrix. Where someone claimed to have seen Laura after July 13th, audio-recorded interviews pinned the time and place, then cross-checked against carrier logs and store data. Conflicts were labeled as contradictions only when the paper showed it. In a couple of interviews, a person described errands to pick up routine supplies. Receipts showed the same shopper at a register buying not just regular household items, but the exact chemicals cataloged later by lab sheets. The file didn't call that motive, it called it alignment. From a viewer's chair, this may feel clinical. That's the point. In a true crime investigation, precision is not performance. The job is to replace uncertainty with accountable minutes. When the record shows a saw bought the morning after a disappearance, chemicals bought near a Texas creek later that week, and no signals from the missing person's device after the night she was last seen, the narrative doesn't need adjectives. It needs the next lawful step. The lawful step after digital and financial mapping is to test the apartment samples against the chemicals documented on receipts. If the drain and grout lifts show components consistent with those purchases, the room tightens into a scene not just by inference, but by lab match. If toolmark class characteristics on recovered remains can be compared to blade type from the purchase, the physical and the digital meet. That is how a file moves from probable to provable. Closing this section, the record now holds a silent device for Laura after July 13th, a tool purchase in North Carolina the next day, later chemical purchases in Fort Bend County near the disposal corridor, and camera-supported movements bracketed by receipts. The outcome isn't announced here. The next work is to lay these facts next to victimology and statements and see which explanations survive the timestamps. The next stage was to weigh what people said against what the records proved. Laura Ackerson, 27, had a consistent routine: work, childcare, and daily communication. According to police reports and court filings, that routine ended on July 13, 2011. After that evening, there were no calls, no texts, no workplace contact. For investigators, that silence was a red flag. A mother in an active custody dispute had no reason to vanish. Detectives interviewed the two adults she was scheduled to meet in Raleigh. Early statements claimed she left the apartment alive and unassisted, but carrier logs showed a negative finding: no phone activity after the evening she arrived. Receipts and surveillance later revealed tool and chemical purchases within days, making the original accounts less credible. Neighbors at the Camden Crest apartments added working testimony: noises of water used late at night and objects carried down a hall. These observations gained weight when matched to chemical traces inside the unit and disposal evidence later recovered in Texas. The triangle of statement, receipt, and forensic sample provided alignment that simple words could not. Investigators also examined Laura's background. Victimology showed reliability, no signs of voluntary flight, and legal obligations she was unlikely to abandon. That analysis made it harder for defense claims of voluntary disappearance to stand. In interviews, detectives noted passive phrases like "she left" or "things happened," especially when time-stamped details were required. Over time, as retail and carrier evidence surfaced, explanations shifted. Each change was documented to show progression and inconsistency. The human dimension remains. When a young mother disappears during a custody dispute, communities feel the breach. But procedure demanded hard facts, and the records delivered them. With statements now pinned to receipts and carrier logs, prosecutors had to decide who files what and where. Charging began in North Carolina because the evidence fixed the Raleigh apartment as the primary scene. Detectives conferred with the Wake County District Attorney on probable cause, a last seen timestamp on July 13th, a negative phone interval for Laura Ackerson after that evening, a parked vehicle that did not move with her, drain and grout samples preserved under seal, and retail documentation showing a reciprocating saw purchased in North Carolina the next morning. According to police reports and court filings summarized in contemporaneous media, those elements justified homicide counts in Wake County and immediate custody of the two adults linked to the apartment. The filing language focused on time, place, and conduct, not motive speculation, because in a major crime file, elements matter more than narratives. Interagency coordination started the same day Raleigh moved to arrest. Fort Bend County authorities were already safeguarding evidence from Oyster Creek and the medical examiner's chain of custody. That Texas record did not claim a homicide scene. It documented post-mortem handling and set the table for a separate offense: tampering with a human corpse. Prosecutors on both sides drew a clean line: North Carolina for killing, Texas for disposal, and chemical attacks on remains. Keeping that boundary clear would prevent a jury later from thinking two different stories were being told. Search authority followed charging. Judges in North Carolina signed warrants for the apartment, associated vehicles, and devices. Orders also covered building management logs and any available common area video. Subpoenas to carriers produced call detail and tower usage for relevant numbers. The output was mapped against retail timestamps already pulled from big box stores. In Texas, local warrants authorized the seizure and analysis of any purchase records for acid and protective gear along the Oyster Creek corridor and secured video from businesses near the recovery locations. None of these orders reached for GPS or app telemetry beyond what a 2011 record could prove. Investigators stayed within era-correct tools, so suppression fights later would be narrow. Evidence transfer ran on paper rails. Raleigh shipped certified copies of retail records, chain of custody forms for the apartment samples, and witness interview recordings. Fort Bend returned certified lab reports as they came in and maintained custody of physical exhibits tied to recovery and chemical testing. Where an item crossed state lines, for example, a container or tool trace thought to link the apartment to disposal, both offices documented possession changes with time, date, and signature so a defense could not claim a break. That paper is unglamorous. It is also what holds a prosecution together years later. The theory of roles was drafted as a matrix, not a story. In North Carolina, prosecutors alleged an intentional killing within the apartment window framed by the last seen time and the dark phone interval. Acts inside the unit were inferred from physical and chemical traces and from the negative absence of any verified departure by Laura. In Texas, prosecutors alleged overt steps to alter, transport, and conceal remains, chemical purchases, access to water, and handling that matched morgue documentation. The matrix did not try to make one jurisdiction absorb the other's elements. Each set of counts aimed to prove only what its own statute required. Defense posture shaped the next moves. Counsel for each adult signaled antagonistic defenses, making severance likely down the road. That expectation influenced how discovery was packaged. Discrete evidentiary packets were prepared so one defendant's statements could be fenced off without compromising the other trial. Interagency teams kept briefings tight and mirrored what Raleigh told Fort Bend told Raleigh, so that witness handling and timing did not conflict across courts. A federal component was considered only as a conduit for interstate assistance. There was no Interpol, no international service, no extraterritorial issues. The interagency here meant 2 DAs, 2 sheriff police offices, 1 medical examiner system, and cooperating labs. The goal was a coherent chain where a North Carolina jury could understand the killing without hearing every Texas detail, and a Texas jury could understand tampering without retrying homicide. By the time charging packages were complete, the case had structure that could survive trial. North Carolina would try homicide based on indoor proofs, last seen, carrier silence, stationary vehicle, apartment traces, and post-event tool procurement. Texas would try tampering based on disposal conduct and chemical acts documented near Oyster Creek. The file did not promise more than that. It promised that every exhibit would be traced from the moment it entered a bag to the moment a juror saw it. Next comes what a jury is actually allowed to hear and what gets excluded before a single opening statement. Before trial, the court had to decide what the jury could hear. Defense attorneys moved to suppress key items: apartment warrants, retail receipts, and phone records. Judges ruled the warrants were specific, the subpoenas properly authorized, and the carrier data admissible under 2011 standards. Statements were trimmed to exclude hearsay or references to the co-defendant, leaving only each defendant's own words. Graphic exhibits were limited. Only morgue images needed to show identification and tool mark features were admitted. Expert testimony was allowed on class characteristics of saw marks and cleaning agents, but with strict guardrails to prevent speculation. The court also severed the defendant's trials to avoid spillover prejudice. Bail was denied given the seriousness of the charges and the risk of obstruction. Coordination between North Carolina and Texas ensured both prosecutions could proceed without conflict. By the end of pre-trial hearings, the core evidence, samples from the apartment, financial and carrier records, morgue identification, and restricted statements, was locked in for trial. Pre-trial hearings narrowed the record. Judges admitted apartment samples, receipts, and carrier logs, but set limits: class-level saw mark analysis only, restricted morgue photos, and each defendant tried separately. Bail was denied. With rulings in place, the case was cleared for trial. Jurors heard a timeline built on minutes. Laura Ackerson, last active July 13, 2011, then silence. They saw receipts for saw blades, chemicals, and cameras from both Raleigh, North Carolina, and later Fort Bend County, Texas. Experts stayed within scope: identification at the morgue, chemistry linking residues, carrier reps authenticating logs. Testimony was restrained yet cumulative: phone dark, vehicle unmoved, purchases matched to disposal sites. Defense stressed gaps and lack of eyewitnesses. Prosecutors returned to the grid, confirmed recovery, corroborated purchases, digital silence. The structure held. Verdicts reflected roles. Grant Hayes, guilty of first-degree murder, life without parole in North Carolina. Amanda Hayes, guilty of second-degree murder in North Carolina, and later tampering with a human corpse in Texas, sentenced to 20 years. In 2024, she was transferred to Texas custody. As I close this story, I can't help but reflect on the hard truth it carries. Crime never happens in isolation. It leaves children without parents, families divided, and communities shaken. What happened to Laura Ackerson reminds us how fragile trust can be and how important it is to recognize early warning signs of control and manipulation. Justice did prevail, but it came at the cost of a young mother's life. So I ask you, what lessons do you believe we can carry into our own relationships and communities to prevent another tragedy like this? If this video spoke to you, share your thoughts in the comments. Let me know where you're watching from or what part of this story resonated most. And if you haven't yet, please subscribe to this channel so you won't miss the next true crime story we bring to light. Together, we can turn these painful cases into lessons that protect and empower us all.